Okay, I think we can get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Aisling, and I work on the research team here at StuRents. We're excited to launch our new StuRents Quarters webinar series today. So we'll be covering data from our national and city level quarterly reports. Please be sure to keep an eye out for the series this year, keep up to date with industry trends and independent insights. Before I hand over to Richard, there's just a couple of bits of housekeeping to take care of. Firstly, these webinars are being run to coincide with the release of our 2023 quarterly market reports. So the first of these is going to be released in the coming days. So please make sure you keep an eye out for them. The session is being recorded, so we'll make sure that everyone gets a copy of that following up from the meeting. I'm delighted to say we're joined by Peter Grant, who's the CEO and chairman of Sandstone. After Richard's data presentation, we're going to hand over to Peter and we'll get to hear some of his thoughts on some key industry themes. And then Peter and Rich will be answering some of your questions at the end of the session. So if you do have any questions, please submit them using the Q&A function and we'll try and get through just as many as we can. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to Rich, who's going to run through some of the StuRents data.
Thanks, Aisling. So just by way of a very quick introduction before we get started, in case anyone's not familiar with who we are. So StuRents is the UK's largest student accommodation ecosystem. We have our marketing platform, StuRents.com, which lists over 750,000 beds. We have our own proprietary property management software that's being used by both HMO agents as well as PBSA operators. And we obviously have our research and data function as well. In terms of the topics that we're going to be covering today, we'll start off with a quick recap, looking at the latest UCAS and demand data. We'll then look into how search behaviour has changed quarter on quarter before touching on some of the PBSA occupancy stats. We'll quickly recap, give you an update on the pipeline, and we'll look at some of the latest data covering HMOs, and then we'll finally, as Aisling said, move on to the Q&A once Peter has finished his part. So to start with, let's look at the latest demand stats. And these stats have obviously been released by HESA. It's worth noting in this particular chart, what we have actually done is we have excluded what HESA classify as alternative providers. And that's any provider that does not receive regular funding from the OFS and isn't a further education college, just so we can keep a like-for-like time series. Just to run through some of those headline numbers then, so we can see that full-time student numbers for 2021 grew by 3.9%, which is great to see, but a slight reduction on the pace of growth compared to 2020. Breaking these numbers down by individual domiciles, so 2021 was really the first year that we saw the impact of Brexit play out. So we saw a significant fall in the number of full-time students from the EU, and they declined by 23.3% year on year, which is obviously a big reduction. When we look at some of the latest UCAS stats in a minute, we'll see the latest update from EU numbers as well, and we'd expect to see further declines. Positively, particularly for the PBSA market, non-EU student growth has been really strong. So numbers were up by 24.5% year on year, which again is a great positive for the PBSA sector in particular. In terms of UK numbers, those were up by just under 1%, which again is a slight reduction in the pace of growth compared to the previous years. But I think the long story short from this particular slide is that UK growth and non-EU growth has essentially negated the declines that we've seen in EU numbers. Looking at this data in a bit more detail, just to look at the splits between postgrads and undergrads. What we saw, particularly over the last couple of years, so 2020 and 2021 in particular, is a huge spike in growth in postgrad numbers. That can partly be attributed to COVID. And I think during COVID, obviously, the jobs market was still very much uncertain. So we had prospective students applying and obviously taking up postgrad courses that may have otherwise not done so. So we can see that in terms of that postgrad growth for 2021, they rose by about 15%, so a significant jump there. Undergraduates rising by just under 1%. So again, 2021, predominantly most of the increase was coming from postgrad numbers. It's worth noting, and something we've discussed in previous sessions, that actually there is a lot of postgrad growth in non-Russell Group universities, which is interesting to note. However, if we do look at somewhere like the University of Glasgow, which obviously is in the Russell Group, we saw that postgrad numbers were up nearly 4,000 students in one particular year. So again, pretty significant jump. As always, though, performance between universities is very much mixed. And if we take UCL, they actually saw a decline of almost 1,000 students, postgrad students in particular, in 2021. Diving into the international numbers, the chart on the right is just showing the top 5 domiciles outside of the UK. And if we isolate these and look at China to start with, we can see that Chinese full-time student numbers rose by almost 6% year on year in 2021. And that equates to about 8,300 additional students. What we can see straight away from the particular chart on the right as well is a huge growth in full-time students from India. So those actually jumped by essentially 54% in 1 year. And that's the equivalent of about 42,000 additional students just from India alone. If we look at the share of Chinese in India and combine that, then actually we can see that those two countries equated to about 43% of all non-UK full-time students. And if we compare that to 2014, those same two countries of origin equated to about 26%. So what that means is we've seen a very rapid rise in full-time students from both China and India. Also interesting to note is that those two countries combined equate to more full-time students than the next 28 individual countries. So a huge reliance on Chinese and Indian students, which are making up a significant proportion of that non-UK demand. Looking at the latest UCAS data, so the UCAS data goes up to 2022, so it gives us a slightly more timely view of the markets. If we start with the chart on the right-hand side, this depicts the growth in acceptances across various tariff groups, i.e. higher, medium or lower. For those of you not familiar, the tariff simply refers to the entry requirements to get into a particular institution. Obviously, higher tariff providers are typically going to be your more prestigious universities. What we saw in kind of previous years was very much those higher tariff providers essentially outperforming the market and growing at a faster pace than medium and lower tariff providers. If we look at the particular bar for 2020, really the start of COVID, where we saw significant impact on the sector, we can see that there was huge growth at these higher tariff providers, and similarly in 2021 as well. Now, the knock-on effect there has been that for 2022, we've essentially seen somewhat a reverse of that trend. So we can see that total acceptances at these higher tariff providers actually declined by 8.3% in 2022, whereas we saw growth of 2.4 and 5.4% at medium and lower tariff providers. Now, one of the reasons for this is essentially over-recruitment from, again, some of these more prestigious universities throughout COVID. Just to give you a few examples here. So if we look firstly at somewhere like the University of Durham, so total yearly acceptances in 2021 were 34.5% higher than 2019. So essentially, as we've already alluded to, that particular institution saw a huge rate of growth during COVID. And the same institution has then seen a reduction of 24% in 2022. So essentially, that's the university scaling back recruitment because it did over-recruit in the previous few years. Similar trends can be seen elsewhere. So University of Manchester, over the same period, they rose by 27%. For 2022, they were down by 13.3%. So again, similar situation where they over-recruited during COVID and then have basically scaled that back. Looking at the chart on the right-hand side, we can see the overall changes by domicile. So interestingly, to note there, particularly for PBSA, is that acceptances for non-EU and UK, I should say now, students were still up, so 15.1%, which is obviously very positive for the sector. And again, we can see the impact there of Brexit, with EU numbers down by a further almost 28%. So significant reductions year on year. Looking at the same data, but just highlighting international students in a bit more detail, the chart on the left, again, is splitting the data by tariff, but in this particular case is looking at only essentially international students. So whilst on the previous slide, what we saw was higher tariff providers scaling back total acceptances, they've actually continued to increase the number from essentially international students. So that's obviously very interesting to note. And actually, there's been reports in the press recently of the government freezing tuition rates, for example, for UK students. And that does mean a real-term squeeze for the finances of universities. So perhaps there's an incentive from these universities that where they can do so, it's more financially beneficial to attract more international students who are paying much higher fees than recruiting more UK students, given the freeze in tuition rates. We can see there, again, medium and lower tariff providers did actually see some substantial jumps, but from relatively low bases in comparison. Chart on the right, again, just highlighting China and India. So we saw previously from the data, full-time student numbers were growing. And again, the UCAS data pointing to a similar trend. And again, acceptances from Chinese and Indian students continuing to grow. As always, and obviously in these sessions, we normally kind of highlight the differences between universities. Headline national figures are very interesting, but actually understanding changes at an institutional level is just, or if not more important. So the chart on the right has just we've picked out a handful of different universities. And what this chart shows is the difference in yearly acceptances versus 2012. So if we pick somewhere like Glasgow, for example, what we saw is a pretty rapid rise, particularly again over the course of COVID, and that has scaled back somewhat for 2022. At the other end of the spectrum, if we take Coventry University, which is the grey line in this particular case, we can see that it's really seen a free fall in acceptances since 2019. And if we look at the figures for 2022, they're down by about 55% versus 2019. So yeah, a significant and pretty rapid decline in total acceptances at Coventry. Interesting to note there as well, that decline does seem to coincide with a fall in the university rankings. The Guardian, for example, produces those along with other companies, and the university has slipped down in those rankings, which does seem to coincide with that fall in acceptances. Moving on to search behavior next, and we can see how that has changed quarter on quarter. So this chart is looking at data that we generate as a listings platform, and we've looked at the data generated for the last quarter versus the previous quarter. So Q1 2023 actually coincides with the start of the 2023-24 letting cycle, and that actually began in October at the end of last year. And what we can quite clearly see is how demand shifted as that start of the letting cycle began. So end of Q4 or 2022, very much one beds in favour. As we started the new season, 4, 5 and 6 beds are predominantly what are being searched for. Main reason for that is mostly domestic students will be house hunting very early. We saw a lot of activity on the platform in October, and as a general rule of thumb, your average domestic student is going to be house hunting in groups, and therefore are requiring, again, in this case, 4, 5 or 6 beds, whereas a general rule of thumb is your international student is going to be searching possibly for 1 bed, possibly for a studio. What is worth noting, as I've already mentioned, is we did see a lot of activity on the platform in October. It's worth noting that most PBSA, not exclusively, but most of them don't actually release their pricing until November at the earliest. So therefore, there is a potential risk there of missing out on some of that very early demand in the market. Equally, what the data shows, because domestic students are, again, typically house hunting in groups, is that for operators of PBSA, again, in particular, if your property management software cannot adequately facilitate group bookings, then you're going to find it harder to attract potentially these domestic students who, again, want to possibly book a 4-bed cluster all in one go, rather than booking individual rooms. It's worth noting that our PMS can actually accommodate that, and that should obviously be an advantage to operators. In terms of just some headline stats there, so we can see for Q1, again, October to December last year, about 80% of all searches were looking for 3 beds or more, and that's, again, as we've already discussed, up significantly compared to the end of the 2022 season. In terms of budget growth, this particular data is looking at when students are house hunting, and in particular for the October to December period, what budgets are they setting when they're doing that? And what we can see is that in the 3-month periods just gone, the average search budget was about £151 per person per week, and that's up 8.5% year on year. And what we can actually see from the chart on the right is that pace of growth is actually slightly higher than the previous years. And that's partly going to be down to rental increases. Obviously, budgets are going to have to grow to accommodate those. And in some markets, we've seen HMO rents increase by more than 10%. And that's going to, again, partly explain why we're seeing budget growth of 8.5% in this case. What is also an interesting trend we've kind of witnessed at the start of the letting cycle is a greater proportion of domestic students actually viewing PBSA properties. So during those 3 months, we saw essentially a 6 percentage point increase in students that are viewing PBSA, which I think probably is partly explained by the bills inclusive nature of purpose built, and obviously that can be attractive to anyone. But particularly for domestic students that are looking at the cost of utilities and maybe deciding to consider PBSA when perhaps they weren't previously. Having said that, HMOs really do still dominate the majority of searches early in the house hunting process. Just continuing on this trend, we've just highlighted 2 locations, so Sheffield and Durham. If we look at the charts, what these are essentially highlighting is, for any given price point, what is the proportion of students that can afford that price? And as price goes up, the proportion of students that can afford that will naturally come down. If we compare Sheffield to Durham, straight away we can see that the average search budget in Durham is a lot higher. And what we can also see is that for the 2023 season, as it has now obviously started, the increase in those budgets has been pretty significant. And we can see the averages there. So for Durham, we're looking at £160 person per week, up from £139. Whereas in Sheffield, we're looking at £129 as the average budget, and that's up from £121 at the same point in the previous year. Moving on to occupancy, for those unfamiliar with this, so we are actually working with the industry's largest stakeholders to collect occupancy data and then provide that back to participants. So if anyone on the call is interested in taking part and receiving that data on an ongoing and timely basis, do reach out. We just wanted to highlight, again, the vast differences between markets, in this case, Coventry versus Exeter. The blue lines, quite simply put, they denote booking velocity in either market for last year, and that's split between clusters and studios. And the orange or yellow lines are the same, but looking at the current letting cycle. So if we look at Exeter, for example, we can see that clusters and studios by September last year were essentially sold out across Exeter, whereas for Coventry, studios didn't perform too badly, but clusters, we can see that by September, on average, we're about 70% occupied or booked, which is obviously notably lower than somewhere like Exeter. We can also see from the curves that Coventry was a later market, so it took a lot longer to be booked compared to Exeter. Looking at the data for this year, again, straight away, we can see the stark differences there. In Exeter, we're seeing, even though we're only 3 months in, a vast improvement in that booking velocity. Exeter was one of the universities that saw lots of recruitment over the last few years during COVID. So those new second and third years, essentially, who are now looking for private accommodation and who were basically recruited during COVID, are probably helping to increase that velocity. In Coventry, things have improved slightly, but as we can quite clearly see, it remains a challenging market compared to somewhere like Exeter. A quick update on the pipeline. Last year, we saw 27,000 beds submitted to planning, pretty much aligned with the previous year, interestingly. In terms of beds approved, again, last year, we saw 24,000 beds approved, up ever so slightly from the previous year. What we can see from the chart on the right-hand side, though, is that we are still very much at historically low levels. So if we take, for example, the number of beds that were approved last year of 24,000, if we compare that to 2018, we're looking at a reduction of about 51%. So actually, the number of beds being submitted and approved, as I said, is actually still pretty low by historical standards. What that means going forward is that the delivery of new PBSA stock, again, is also going to be comparatively low. Obviously, that is potentially going to be problematic for markets that are particularly tight from a supply and demand perspective. Just to pick out some kind of notable submissions and approvals in the last few months, obviously there's a lot more than this, but there has been some very large developments, both submitted and approved. One that sticks out there, for example, was in Manchester, where a scheme containing more than 1,000 beds was put forward. Equally, on the approval side, essentially a 1,200 bed development in Leeds was granted planning permission. Again, this list is much more comprehensive. These are really just some of the highlights. In terms of the total pipeline, nationally, we're looking at about 117,000 beds in the pipeline and around 84,000 beds with planning. As we've already touched on, we would expect the delivery of new stock to be relatively low, both because of the reduction in the number that are being put forward, but also the difficulties around financing as well as build costs. And again, that could further curtail the delivery of new developments. One interesting location we have kept a close eye on is Newcastle. So that is a city that historically, you could argue, was oversupplied with PBSA, and post 2018, there was really no new developments being proposed. However, what we saw last year was a few relatively large schemes put forward, which again, interesting to note, given the previous lack of planning there. Just the final slide before I hand over to Peter. What we wanted to do on this particular one is just highlight, again, data actually provided by HESA, and the chart on the right-hand side depicts the number of students that have indicated they're living in a particular accommodation type. So we have essentially PBSA, those that are living at home, and essentially what we have classified as non-PBSA. I think, again, there are a lot of kind of anecdotes in the market around a reduction in the HMO sector in terms of supply. It's very difficult to get data on this. We've looked at this particular insight. We've also tracked, for example, a number of properties exempt from council tax because they are occupied by students. And again, that shows a similar trend. Having said that, we do have to treat these data sets with a little bit of caution because there are questions over the accuracy. I think the big question really is whether this increase in non-PBSA represents new HMO stock, or is it simply stock that is possibly not technically classified as a HMO, for example, 2 beds. And even a lot of locations do have Article 4s in place, that doesn't necessarily entirely prevent new stock coming to market, albeit it should make it much, much more harder or difficult. So that is something worth bearing in mind. And equally, again, anecdotally, we do hear of landlords perhaps selling up. What is somewhat unclear is whether that's actually leading to stock exiting the market, or is it simply a consolidation? I mean, there's a number of HMO landlords we know in the market that are looking to gain more exposure, not less. So again, it's very different to have a scenario where the market's consolidating versus actually declining. Of course, there are also headwinds in the HMO markets. I know we'll touch on some of these. I think one of the big ones is going to be around changes to EPC legislation that comes in 2025, and that's could cause some headaches. I think there's going to be plenty of landlords that perhaps don't have the capital required to upgrade their properties, which they'll need to do to make sure they have a minimum rating of C, and that's by 2025. But again, that does present opportunities for perhaps some of the more institutional landlords to actually buy that stock up, deploy the capital, and essentially increase their portfolios. I think at this stage I'll probably stop. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Peter and let him take control. As Ashling's already said, we're releasing our quarterly reports in the coming days, so do look out for those. But yeah, if I can hand over to Peter, over to you, and yeah, really looking forward to seeing what you have to say.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. I'm going to request remote control. There we go.
Okay, over to you.
Right, okay. I'm going to talk about student PRS. That's something that we've been involved in for a very, very long time. I've got a relatively short space of time to get through what's an enormous subject, so I'm going to move at speed and pretty high level. Try and make my mouse work. Cool. Yeah, so just to give you a bit of context, we've been involved in the business for the last 25 years. We help clients to invest, and we create safe and affordable green homes to rent. We cover 10 university cities. We've got clients in 40 countries around the world. And what we do as a business is we source properties as an investment, we renovate them, we furnish them, and we manage them. So we're the kind of machine that acts on behalf of lots and lots of clients, some large, some small, in entering the student PRS market. We launched a REIT last year, and it's small and cute still, but excited for it to grow. And we are, as a business, 100% carbon neutral. I'm not going to touch too much on that in this particular session, but useful background information. The cities we operate in are at the bottom of the screen there. I'm not going to go to them all individually at this point. So what does student the PRS market look like? Well, in my day, it didn't look anything like the pictures here, but these are typical properties that come through our system, and gives you a feel for what they look like from an internal point of view. House prices, in terms of the big picture of numbers, have grown by 7% per annum over the last 35 years. Well-documented shortage of housing. It's as bad today, if not worse, than it was 25 years ago when I first started buying my first properties. And it doesn't matter which government or which colour of which political flavour is in power, they always talk about building new houses and fall short. Universities are growing, as we've just heard about, and students are, as a category of tenant, we work with other tenants other than just purely students, but as a category of tenant, they're very attractive because they're low risk, supported by guarantors who are parents. And what we've found generally in the context of PRS is that the large regional university cities give the best overall investor returns. So we don't tend to operate in London, the southeast, where the ratio of price versus rent is less favourable. Just a couple of numbers, and these are kind of market numbers as well as our own numbers. Historical returns on the PRS side, student PRS side, are 28% per annum over the last 25 years, and that's assuming gearing of 75%. We can talk about that for quite a long time in its own right, but just as a headline, that's a useful number to have in the back of your mind. Yields that we typically operate at are above the market averages, but 6.5% gross to roughly a 4.5% net. And we are seeing significant rental growth, higher than what was highlighted by Richard. And it could well be that it's a consequence of what we do in the areas we choose and so on. But in the last few years, typically 10 to 15%, Scotland's going up slightly faster than England. We tend to assume and work to, you know, a 5% assumption in terms of long-term sustainable growth, but it seems to always significantly outperform that. And in terms of prospects looking forward, well, it's very difficult to look forward, but the house supply shortages remain, and they kind of underpin the market. And, you know, there's nothing that we see that's going to particularly change in terms of that dynamic. And therefore, both in terms of buying and in terms of renting, we kind of feel that rents and house prices are going to carry on going up. I think that's borne out by many of the current headlines and what we're finding in the market right now. Threats, rent control obviously is a potential threat. Bank lending rates are an irritant and you know, a problem for landlords who've become very addicted to low-cost money. And the amount of red tape that there is in the sector is large and growing, which arguably is very bad for some and good for others that embrace it. And I would say, to summarize all of that, student PRS, so, you know, houses rented to students features are low risk, high returns, low volatility is what my experience over the last 25 years is. And some of those threats are actually, you know, crisis for some people and causing people to exit, and an opportunity for consolidation. We'll come back to that in a second in terms of the big picture. If we look at the whole sector, it's very large in number. I'm not sure I have a totally accurate number on just what size it is, but this is what Google tells me. It's massive. And the sectors are probably broken down: students, young professionals, key workers, family, social housing, corporate lets. And we get involved with students and young professionals just because that's where the volume is. And that's the bit that we like the most. We've also got involved in the other areas over the years. Tend to have withdrawn it. We focus very much on students, young professionals and key workers these days. Reasons for that: family housing tends to be price sensitive. Social housing does tend to be higher risk. We have dabbled there. And corporate lets market is just a much smaller market overall in the cities that we're in. If we look at the big picture of everything and just take a step back, everything kind of stemmed from 2004 Housing Act. And I remember being at a conference down in London at Linklaters, where all the industry gurus were present and so on, and looking at the residential market as an opportunity for them. And really, there was three things that came out of that. One was to do with safety. One was to do with the professionalization of the sector, because it's a very much a cottage industry, still arguably is today. But how does the government generally professionalize it? And then also the rival or the residential REITs made possible in the UK with the legislation there. So safety is very much about HMO. HMO means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but fundamentally it's about safety, and it's a good thing. We tend to embrace that, and even for 1 and 2 bedroom flats, we put the HMO safety features in just because it's a sensible thing to do. The professionalization is really encouraging institutions to get more involved, and I think, you know, just in conversations with many institutions now really circling the sector and going, right, how do we get more into this, as it were? And on the REIT side, that's how do they attract international investment into the UK and compete with other REITs globally, as it were. The institutional issues are how to access stock and how to manage it. Those were the two that were raised in 2004, and I think it's probably the same today. There seems to be a lot of capital seeking a home and not many places for it to go. But the real issue, the massive issue that everyone's kind of overlooking, is the house supply shortages. And that's been present for the whole period that I've been involved in the sector. And it's just not changing. The dynamic is not changing. So that is the elephant in the room. If we look at some of the recent political and economic events, obviously, you know, looking back a little bit in time, banking crisis, really not a happy time for anyone. Ongoing planning control, so whether it's Article 4s or whether it's other things that come into play, they are, you know, restrictive in nature, which is preventing the house supply from getting addressed. And in 2014, for the private landlords, and you know, that were really, you know, sort of in the market and dominating the PRS market, major tax changes came afoot where you could no longer deduct bank interest from your revenue as a tax deduction. And 2019, obviously, COVID really had a huge impact, as it were, and more recently, the energy crisis. And what's interesting is that there are various things that have come into play, probably in Scotland ahead of England. Explain that a little bit as to why I think that is. Scotland seems to be the leader in some of these things over England. But there are temporary rent controls which have come into play in Scotland. Temporary eviction controls come into play in Scotland. And banking margins generally across the board have gone up. So when I look back to before the banking crisis, bank margins were typically 1.25% over base LIBOR or whatever back in the day. Today they're 2.5% and perhaps higher. So there's a real significance and a difference in terms of not just the base rates, but also the margins that the banks charge on top of that. And planning controls, UK-wide, major problem. So while all that's going on, the one thing they're not addressing is the thing they should be addressing, which is the house supply shortages. So they're doing everything else but addressing what the actual issue is. So if we look at the student sector, it's large, it's growing, it's not very price sensitive is what we found, because students are choosing their properties in the PRS sector on the basis of location, point number one, and quality, point number two. And it's mum and dad that are paying, by and large. And so it's not very price sensitive, so attractive from an investor perspective. And the guarantors are the parents. In our case, we've got every student has got a guarantor in the background. So very safe in terms of rents coming in. Two types, as we've discussed, halls of residence and PRS. And obviously, by and large, I think I'm right in saying that first years really dominate the halls of residence scenes, plus overseas students, and perhaps postgrads as well. PRS tend to be, so we tend to pick up students from second year onwards where they're encouraged to leave and they want to leave anyway and form their own groups and clusters and so on. So we rent 2, 3, 4, 5 bedroom flats to students from second year onwards. What's really interesting is that obviously they are very, although in common is the student side, very different is the type of classification they've got. So halls of residence are absolutely commercial property and obviously PRS or residential, and that has a significant impact on how it's valued. So rents become super, super important in the case of halls of residence because that's the multiplier that effectively acts against, against the valuation, as it were. Whereas in the PRS, it's totally different. It's just what's the value of the house next door as a simplistic measure. So risks are different as well because in the financial crisis, obviously, halls of residence, because they were commercial property in nature, had more of an issue to overcome there. So if it's the wrong part of the cycle, not great. And housing generally doesn't have the same characteristics. It's not easy to sell and it's based on the house next door anyway. So high percentage of institutional investors are in halls of residence, in my experience, and a low percentage, very low percentage, are in the PRS sector at the moment. The government's obviously trying to change that and encourage that to change. Sector size, the PRS sector is absolutely enormous, is the bottom line. Huge, huge opportunity there for institutions to come in. And from what I'm getting fed back, and this is from people who are trying to buy student housing, student halls of residence and so on, is that there's very, very fierce competition in buying. And the PRS sector is, how do you access the stock? That's the issue there. So what's going on? Let's have a look at Scotland. And Nicola's a very topical subject. I actually put these slides together before she announced her departure yesterday, or intended departure yesterday. But Nicola Sturgeon has been dominating the scene in Scotland on a whole variety of fronts for a number of years. And her driver is that she wants to be better than England, right? So there's things happening in Scotland ahead of happening in England. And that could be, that's driven more recently by Green Coalition partner, and particularly focusing on vulnerable tenants and, as a secondary issue, oil, part of their gig as well. And the feature of Nicola is that she tries different things, and she's much more innovative and willing to try things in Scotland than the UK government is, and always go for consultations. And another feature of Nicola is that she doesn't actually listen to a single word anyone says. So we've stopped participating in consultations with everything because there's a closed agenda and there's no point. On the UK government side, they tend to say, right, let's go for it. You know, we'll watch what Scotland does, and it doesn't matter whether it's smoking or rental safety or plastic bags, gender identity, whatever. They kind of watch what Scotland does and then takes the best bits and adopts the best bits, as it were. But where this becomes interesting is where she's been dabbling on the rental sector, and particularly on no fixed term leases, and also on rent controls. So we're going to have a look at that in a little bit more detail. Allegedly aimed at the most vulnerable tenants, question mark, not sure about that in the first category. Second one, absolutely, is what she's trying to do is with rent controls for short-term period of time, is the most, protect the most vulnerable tenants during the energy crisis, as it were. The impact on the PRS sector from an occupancy point of view is that there has been no impact that we can see and that we're feeling. Now, we have had to adapt. And so where there's no longer a fixed term lease, we've had to change how we operate as a business. But the end result to both landlords and to us as a business is pretty much zero. So that's an interesting point there. On the rents, none on the fixed term leases. There is a curious thing happening, particularly in Scotland right now, where the rents are absolutely going through the roof. And so if we look at what's happening in the market in the last 2 or 3 months versus, let's say, August of last year, rents have kind of been of the level of, really good area, really good rent, £700 a month. The market seems to have jumped to £1,000 a month in really good areas, and not entirely clear why that is and what's caused that. Too early to tell, but there's a significant increase in rents that we're seeing, which happens to coincide with rent controls, but it also happens to coincide with other things such as bank lending rates going up. House prices, no impact that we've seen for either, and yields, if anything, increasing. So I would say in terms of the Scottish experience, and I'm going through this at great speed, and I do apologise about that, but lessons for England, I think, are number one, don't be afraid of change, just embrace it and adapt it. That was what my words of wisdom would be, having gone through it in Scotland. And definitely work with industries experts to make sure you get it right. And I think the third thing is the supply shortages are being exacerbated, creating, I think, opportunities. And back to the core point that they're doing everything else but addressing the actual issue that really exists in the housing market today, which is house supply shortages. So I've got a pop-up which I'm going to try and get rid of. My apologies. So to summarize all that, there are significant supply shortages and they may get worse. Major players are having difficulty accessing and managing stock, and our own REIT is one way to address that. Politicians are not addressing the actual issues, and exiting landlords creates consolidation opportunities. And we're seeing large, well, when say smaller landlords with maybe 60, 70, 100 properties are now really sort of interested in leaving the sector. And I think there's definitely a consolidation opportunity ahead. Whether taking Richard's point, that reduces the amount of stock, I'm not sure. Don't think so, because I think there's new people coming in that want to buy that stock up. And real rental growth, I think it could actually accelerate, just with the dynamics of what's going on and what we're seeing live on the ground. My hunch is that rental growth will actually accelerate in the next year for sure. And whoops, that is it. Thank you very much indeed. I think we got a question and answer. I'm going to hand back to Aisling, I think.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, you're really interesting. Yeah, Aisling, if you want to kind of essentially take back control, and we'll go through some of the Q&As. I'm conscious of time, so we'll try and kind of squeeze in as many as we can. Yeah, over to you, Aisling.
Yeah, so in the interest of time, we'll just get on with it. So the first one, I think both of you probably have some opinions on, but I think, Rich, I'll start with you. And it's, what are the panelists' views on renting green accommodation? Is there an increasing appetite for this, and are students willing to pay a premium for it?
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, I think there's a lot more interest in the topic, obviously, and I think that's naturally a good thing. I think anecdotally, it really comes down to the individual students. There's always going to be a proportion of students that can afford it and are therefore happy to essentially pay higher rents to get that green property, so to speak. But equally, I think particularly for the average domestic student, and Peter may have different opinions, if you're looking at two equal properties and one is slightly more expensive, it really just comes down to personal circumstances. Can you afford to pay that premium for that green product? And obviously some will and some won't. On the actual topic, I mean, what we are also seeing is PBSA looking at, particularly PBSA, looking at ways to, I guess, more accurately measure the impact. So whether that's, sensors in rooms, whatever it may be, to actually at least start to try and make tenants aware of their impact, particularly carbon impact. And I think, if you go along the routes of almost try to, gamification of that. So if you have a block of PBSA with, let's just say 200 tenants, and you can identify these top 10 tenants are using the most utilities, that may incentivize them to cut back slightly. I think it's still relatively early days on that process, but it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. And if obviously more operators start to take that approach, does it actually lead to a reduction in utilities costs, which again, still early days to say, but it'd be interesting to see how that, as I say, does play out. Yeah, Peter, I know you mentioned about the green angle, so it'd be interesting to kind of get your thoughts.
Yeah, we kind of embraced the green agenda since, we're going way back to 2006. So when we renovate a property and, totally strip out the interior and rebuild it with safety features and everything else, we also put in a bunch of features which can reduce have reduced the energy by 30% or thereabouts, so we can improve everything by about 30%. We did that working with the Carbon Trust and the Energy Saving Trust. So we've been doing it for a long period of time. The important thing, two things to remember. One is that it is a major issue for the younger generations. So what we find is that it's high up in the agenda for tenants, less so for investors and landlords, and almost they see it as an irritant and a cost. That might be a generational thing, I don't know. So, but if the client base, the renting client base thinks it's important, trust me, it's important for everyone, kind of thing. But the second thing is that if you actually reduce your carbon footprint in a building by, let's say, 30%, you're also reducing the energy consumption by 30%. So there is a benefit to the tenants. And I think that if you look at the tenants as the customer, rather than as the shareholders of an institution as the customer, then I think it's a major thing to try and get right. And I fully support the government in trying to encourage the EPC ratings to improve across the sector. I think it's a really good thing overall.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So taking a slightly different topic, how long can rental growth for high-end accommodation outstrip middle or low-end accommodation? At some point, surely the rent spread just becomes too much. Rich, do you want to start?
Yeah, again, obviously, PBSA generally is actually, there is a relatively broad spread. I know there's a lot of focus, obviously, on the high-end accommodation. As always, I'd go back to something we mentioned earlier. It really comes down to the individual city. So you have a city or location that is, let's just say, predominantly Chinese students. A proportion of those are always willing to pay top end because, quite simply, they want the best, and therefore that spread is perhaps, possibly less relevant. I think where it starts to possibly become an issue is where you are in a location or market that perhaps is more reliant on the domestic student, who are potentially more price sensitive and therefore would look at the two accommodation types and just quite simply, whether it's an internal calculation, say it's not worth me paying an extra X per person per week. I'll go for the slightly cheaper option that is still relatively good in terms of quality. Yeah, so again, I think it will come down to individual cities and the supply and demand in those local areas, as well as the tenant mix, essentially.
Shortage of supply is the answer for the PRS sector. There's a massive shortage of supply. Lots and lots of stories about, literally a landlord. Once you're through the letting series, a landlord or a letting agent putting one property up onto the portal for 2 hours and getting 120 inquiries. there's no way anything else is going to happen other than rents are going to carry on going up. But I think in terms of what drives people beyond, let's assume they have got choice. I think the number one driver is location, and the number two driver behind that is condition. But I think people are willing to pay. I'm astonished about how much money people are willing to pay for rents and so on when you put it to the test, as it were. And I think the market, and it just comes back to the shortage of supply, but I think the driver in terms of the motives would be number one, location. So almost condition is less relevant. It is 100% about location on the student PRS side.
Yeah, I think the kind of similar angle. Obviously, we advertise properties for HMO landlords and agents as well as PBSA, and some HMO landlords, as you've mentioned, Peter, can basically sell out with very little, if zero, marketing cost, whereas your PBSA operator that might be paying X% away in agency fees or otherwise, the cost of actually filling the bed for, again, PRS, student HMO, whatever you want to call it, can be a fraction compared to PBSA, if not, possibly zero in some cases, which I think is obviously very attractive to institutions.
Okay, I think we'll have to make this the last question. But how much are operating expenses projected to rise in the next year? And Rich, I'll start with you again.
Yeah, it's something we kind of covered in our annual reports. Obviously, from a PBSA standpoint, it's a mixed bag because some of those operators are essentially hedged against those increases that we saw, particularly the last 12 months, really. But again, some won't be. So again, a little bit of a mixed bag. If we're looking at essentially the cost of utilities for particularly, again, student HMOs, we were looking, I think, about 80% increase year on year, something around about £24, £24 per person per week, just for the utilities element. So that has obviously gone up pretty significantly. I think more positively, if you look at the futures market for gas, it's certainly come down. Obviously, prices generally have come down. But if we compare what the futures market was expecting in, say, August of last year compared to today, it's much, much lower, which obviously is going to be less painful, I guess, from an operator standpoint than where it possibly could have been. Obviously, that is a positive piece of news from the whole kind of utilities situation.
I think on the PRS side, I think the students are getting a really tough time. So the tenants generically, because they're obviously in this sector picking up the cost of gas, electricity and so on, they pay their own utility bills. So I think their expenses and their costs have really gone up through the roof, as it were, in the last 12 months because, as I say, they're liable for that. Investors, I think, less so because I think most costs can be contained on the PRS side. There will be some inflation, of course. Unfortunately, the cost of repairs seems to be going up because the Poles have all gone back to Poland. And Brexit has caused a shortage of contractors in that sector, as it were. So there is a bit of inflation that's coming in that side, but that's a small quantum of money in the first place. So even though the percentages, let's say 10% up year on year, it's on a relatively small amount of money, kind of thing. So I think I feel for the students, to be honest. I feel for the tenants that pick up the energy costs.
On Peter as well, I know you mentioned it on your slides. Obviously, with the ban on fixed-term tenancies that came in Scotland, have you seen that resulting in less interest in PRS and students, or again, not seen really any impact?
No change whatsoever. We've had to adapt, as I alluded to when I was going through it. So the rental cycle has changed completely. So in Edinburgh, if you take Edinburgh as a city, we would usually start renting properties really quite late, sometimes June, July, August for August occupancy. And now we tend to market them much, much earlier with a view to people going in when everyone wants to leave. So the key thing is now not the entry date, it's the exit date, and trying to get, but because on the PRS side, there's a shortage of supply, we can pretty much insist that, the flat's available from this time, take it or leave it. If it doesn't suit you to get that flat at that point, then go for another one, which will become available later. But the later in the season you get, the less choice you've got. So very noticeably, Glasgow had to tell thousands of students to return home because they just could not find any accommodation whatsoever. We had a few headlines this year as one example, but other ones, headlines of students living in cars because there are no properties. It's crazy, absolutely crazy. Government's got to do something about it.
And are you finding as well those students are staying longer because there is no essentially term? Are they staying for more than 1 year, or is it very much still?
We try and encourage them to stay for longer anyway. So I don't have the data to give an accurate answer to that question right now. But it's effectively bums on seats. Trying, from a landlord investor perspective, keeping maximum occupancy. So we would try and encourage to re-sign tenants for a second, third, and fourth year. Sometimes they change their group size, so they want to move from a 4-bedroom to 3-bedroom or 4-bedroom to 5-bedroom, depending on friends and what happens there. But generally speaking, we would try and encourage them anyway. I'm not sure it's got worse. I know that the shortage of housing, kind of almost like getting a property, is like gold dust in some cities now. So you do tend to find students hanging on to them at all costs because they just can't get them, and they can't even get a viewing to see a property. It's crazy, absolutely crazy.
I think, as you said earlier, in terms of Scotland almost leading the way on some of this legislation, it'd be interesting to see what the end result is in England, whether they just take a view of saying, it's caused a lot of issue in the Scotland market for various reasons. Actually, let's maybe review it and readdress. So it'd be interesting to see as and when it does, obviously the renters reform I'm talking about, what the final impact actually is and what that does look like.
Yeah. And I really think it boils down to just simply supply and demand. It's simple as that. As long as there's a shortage of supplies, whether it's positive residence or whether it's the private rented sector, I think that's going to drive everything else. And if the student numbers are increasing, as you've pointed out, Richard, every year, and there's insufficient stock coming out of the market overall, then it just makes it worse. The elephant gets bigger.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Yeah, Aisling, back to you.
Yeah, well, thank you both for all those great insights. I think it's great to get kind of a bit of perspective from the HMO market as well as the PBSA. Unfortunately, we obviously have more questions, but in the interest of time, we do have to wrap up there. Any other questions, we will try to follow up via email. And if all of our participants, please be sure to follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook to make sure you don't miss any of our future updates as well. And I think that just leaves me to say a big thank you to Peter and of course Richard for your informative presentations and for your great answers to everyone's questions. And thank you to everyone for joining the call, and we hope to see you again soon. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.